The flames in the stone hearth cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, but Philip Brennan could not bring himself to care about the beauty of firelight tonight, not when exhaustion weighed down his bones, yet sleep refused to claim him. He sat with his back against the wooden support beam, legs stretched out before him, one hand resting on his thigh while the other traced absent patterns in the dust beside him, his mind replaying the ambush that had nearly killed them all 3 days prior. The converted barn that served as their temporary shelter creaked in the mountain wind, and across the dim space, past the dying embers and the scattered bedrolls of his sleeping companions, he heard it soft as a breath, uncertain as a prayer, his name murmured in that distinctive voice that had haunted his thoughts since the day she had joined their desperate flight from the burning village. Philip. He turned his head sharply, peering through the gloom toward the corner where Karga lay on a thin blanket, her broad shoulders rising and falling with what he had assumed was the steady rhythm of sleep. But her eyes were open now, reflecting the firelight like amber caught in twilight, and she was looking directly at him with an expression he could not quite read. For a moment neither of them moved, the space between them filled with unspoken questions, and the weight of everything that had happened since they had met. "You should be sleeping," he said quietly, mindful of the others scattered around the barn. Marcus and his wife Elena, old Gerard who had lost everything, young Thomas still recovering from the sword wound in his side. "So should you," Karga replied, her voice low and slightly rough, the way it always was, carrying an edge that reminded him she was not human no matter how much he sometimes forgot that fact in her presence. She shifted slightly, propping herself up on one elbow, and he could see the subtle play of muscle beneath her green skin, the careful way she moved so as not to disturb the others. "You have not slept in 2 nights. 3, he corrected without thinking, then wondered why he had admitted it. There was something about her that made him speak more honestly than he intended, as if those amber eyes could see through any pretense he might construct. She was silent for a long moment, studying him with that intense focus that had unnerved him when they first met, but which now felt oddly comforting, as if someone was truly seeing him rather than simply looking in his direction. Then she rose, moving with the fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone of her size and strength, and crossed the space between them with footsteps so light they barely whispered against the packed earth floor. "May I sit?" she asked, and he nodded, uncertain what else to do. Karga settled beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, could catch the scent of wood smoke and pine that clung to her clothes. She was taller than him by nearly half a head, broader across the shoulders, her arms thick with the kind of strength that came from a lifetime of hard work. Her tusks small but undeniably, they're curved up from her lower jaw, giving her face a fierce quality that had frightened him when he first saw her standing in the ruins of what had been his family's farm. Now those tusks simply seemed like part of who she was, as natural as the slight point to her ears or the way her dark hair fell in a thick braid down her back. "Tell me what keeps you awake," she said, not quite a command but not quite a request either. Philip drew a long breath, considering whether to deflect with some easy lie, but found he did not want to. "I keep seeing Thomas go down," he admitted. "Keep seeing that raider's blade coming toward his neck. Keep thinking about how close we came to losing him, to losing all of this." He gestured vaguely at the sleeping forms around them. "These people trust me to lead them to safety, and I have no idea what I'm doing. You got us through the mountain pass when Marcus said it was impossible," Karga pointed out. "You found this shelter when we had nowhere else to go. You convinced the trader in Millbrook to give us supplies even though we had nothing to pay with." "I begged," Philip said flatly, There's a difference between leading and begging. There is also a difference between leading and knowing everything, she countered. A leader keeps going when others would stop. You do that. You have done it every day since I met you. He turned to look at her properly, seeing the way the firelight caught in her eyes, the way it painted warm highlights across her green skin. She had appeared at his farm 6 weeks ago, stumbling out of the forest with blood on her clothes and terror in her face, begging for help in broken common that he had barely understood. His first instinct had been to reach for the hunting bow mounted above the door, because everyone knew orcs were dangerous, were monsters who raided human settlements and took prisoners into the dark places of the world. But something in her eyes had stopped him, a desperate humanity that transcended species, a plea that spoke to something deeper than fear or prejudice. He had let her hide in his barn that first night, had brought her food and water and bandages for the wounds that covered her arms and back. She had not spoken much, had watched him with wary distrust as if expecting him to attack her at any moment. It was only the next morning, when the soldiers had come through searching for an escaped orc prisoner, that he had understood what she was running from. And when they had demanded to search his property, he had lied for her, had said he had seen no one, had sent them riding off toward the eastern valleys while she hid beneath loose hay in his barn. That decision had changed everything. The soldiers had returned 3 days later with accusations and threats, and when Philip had refused to recant his story, they had arrested him for harboring an enemy of the realm. It was Karga who had freed him, who had broken the lock on the wagon where they were transporting him to the garrison, who had led him into the forest where they could disappear among the ancient trees. And it was Karga who had been with him when they stumbled upon the burning remains of Millbrook, when they had pulled Marcus and Alina and the others from the flames, and begun this desperate journey toward the border where perhaps, just perhaps, they might find sanctuary. "Why did you come back for me?" Philip asked now, the question he had been carrying for weeks finally finding voice. "When they arrested me, you could have run. You could have disappeared into the mountains and been free. Instead, you risked everything to break me out of that wagon." Karga was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "You were the first human who looked at me and saw a person," she said. "The first who offered help without demanding anything in return. I could not leave you to suffer for that kindness." "You barely knew me," Philip protested. "I knew enough," she said firmly. "I knew you gave me food when you could have driven me away. I knew you lied to soldiers to protect me. I knew you were good." She paused, then added with something that might have been humor, "Also, you looked very sad in that cage. I do not like seeing sad things." Despite everything, Philip found himself smiling. "I was fairly sad," he admitted. "That cage smelled terrible." "All human cages smell terrible," Karga said with conviction. "Orcs would never build such poorly ventilated prisons. I'll keep that in mind if I'm ever designing a prison. Please do." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the fire burn lower, listening to the wind outside and the soft sounds of sleeping people around them. Philip found his exhaustion beginning to catch up with him now, the tension that had kept him rigid slowly bleeding away in Karga's presence. There was something deeply calming about sitting beside her, something that made the fears and doubts that plagued him feel more manageable, less overwhelming. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "Yes. Why were you in those cages? What happened before you came to my farm?" He felt her tense beside him, saw the way her hands curled into fists against her knees. For a moment he thought she would refuse to answer, that he had pushed too far into territory she was not ready to share. But then she drew a slow breath and began to speak. "My clan lives in the Stormbreak Mountains," she said. We keep to ourselves, trade sometimes with the northern villages, cause no trouble. But 6 months ago, a new commander came to the garrison at Redstone. He decided that orcs were a threat that needed to be eliminated, that we were planning raids and attacks even though we had done nothing. Her voice hardened. He sent soldiers into our territory. They burned our homes, killed anyone who resisted, took prisoners. Gods, Philip breathed. How many? 40 of us were captured. I do not know how many died in the initial attack. She was staring at the fire now, her jaw tight. They took us to Redstone, put us in cages, said we would be tried for crimes against the realm, but there was no trial. Just beatings and interrogation and demands that we confess to raids we had never committed. How did you escape? There was a storm. Lightning struck one of the guard towers and started a fire. In the confusion, 3 of us managed to break free. We ran in different directions. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I do not know if the others made it. Philip felt something twist in his chest, a combination of rage at the injustice she had described and profound sorrow for everything she had lost. Without really thinking about it, he reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. She started slightly at the contact, her eyes snapping to his face, and for a heartbeat, he thought he had made a terrible mistake. But then her hand turned beneath his, her fingers curling around his palm, and they sat there connected by that simple touch as the fire burned down to coals. I'm sorry, he said, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry humans did that. You did not do it, Karga said. No, but my people did. My kingdom did. He squeezed her hand gently. If there was any way I could make it right, I would. You already have, she told him, and there was something in her voice that made his breath catch. You gave me shelter when I had none. You protected me when you had no reason to. You gave up your home, your safety, everything, rather than betray me. That is more than making it right. That is, she paused, seeming to struggle for words. That is everything. They looked at each other across the small space between them, and Philip felt something shift in his chest, some wall he had been maintaining without quite realizing it beginning to crumble. Karga was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not in the conventional human way, not with delicate features or soft curves, but beautiful nonetheless in the strength of her bearing, the intelligence in her eyes, the fierce loyalty that radiated from her like heat from the sun. Beautiful in the way she moved, in the way she spoke, in the way she had risked everything to save him just as he had risked everything to save her. Karga, he began, not sure what he intended to say, but she squeezed his hand and shook her head slightly. You need to sleep, she said gently. We have a long walk tomorrow if we are going to reach the border crossing. She was right, of course. They had at least 3 more days of hard travel through increasingly difficult terrain, and he could not afford to collapse from exhaustion before they reached safety. But the thought of moving away from her, of breaking this moment of connection, felt almost physically painful. Will you stay here? He asked. Just for a while, Karga nodded, settling her back against the support beam beside him. I will stay. Philip let his eyes close, let his head tip back against the wood, and with Karga's hand still warm in his own, sleep finally began to pull him down into darkness. He woke to pale gray light filtering through the gaps in the barn walls, and the sound of people moving around, preparing for another day of travel. For a moment he was disoriented, confused about why his shoulder was pressed against something warm and solid, why his hand was tingling with pins and needles. Then memory returned in a rush, and he realized he had fallen asleep leaning against Karga, their hands still clasped together, her head resting lightly against the top of his. She stirred as he shifted, her eyes opening with the instant alertness of someone accustomed to danger. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and Philip saw his own confusion and wonder reflected in her amber eyes. Then Marcus called out something about needing to check the supplies, and the spell was broken. They separated awkwardly, both standing and brushing dust from their clothes with exaggerated focus. Philip was acutely aware of the others watching them, Alina with knowing eyes and a small smile, Thomas with open curiosity, Gerard with something that might have been disapproval. He felt heat rise in his face and busied himself with rolling up his bedding, trying not to think about how right it had felt to fall asleep beside her. The day's journey was brutal. They climbed higher into the mountains along a path that was barely more than a game trail, picking their way over loose scree and around massive boulders. Alina turned her ankle on a hidden rock and had to be supported between Marcus and Thomas. Gerard's breathing grew labored in the thin air, forcing frequent stops. By midday they had covered perhaps 5 miles, and Philip could see the exhaustion written on every face. He called a halt in a small clearing where a stream tumbled down the mountainside, and people collapsed gratefully onto rocks and fallen logs. While the others rested, Philip scouted ahead, trying to gauge how much further they would need to push before they could stop for the night. The path grew steeper, more treacherous, winding between sheer cliff faces that made him dizzy to look at. He was studying the route when Karga appeared beside him, moving with that silent grace that still surprised him. "This way is dangerous," she observed. "Every way is dangerous," Philip replied, "but this one leads to the border, if we do not fall to our deaths first." She studied the path with a critical eye. "The elderly human will not make it. His heart struggles with this altitude." Philip's stomach sank because he knew she was right. Gerard was in his 60s, had spent his life farming in the lowlands, and was completely unprepared for this kind of exertion. "Do you know another route?" he asked. Karga was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "There is a pass my people use sometimes. Lower elevation, easier terrain, but it goes through orc territory, my clan's territory." "Would they help us?" she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I was cast out for defending myself against a human who attacked me first. My clan believes humans are the enemy, believes any orc who shows them kindness is a traitor. If we go that way, we may face hostility from orcs as well as humans." Philip weighed the options, looking back at the exhausted group huddled by the stream. "Can Gerard make it the way we're going?" he asked quietly. "No," Karga said with certainty. "Then we take the lower pass, even if it means facing my people. Even then," he met her eyes, "we've made it this far together, we'll make it the rest of the way." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The path branches about a mile ahead. We will go left instead of right." They returned to the group, and Philip explained the change of route, carefully omitting the detail about traveling through orc territory. Marcus looked skeptical but did not argue. Alina simply nodded, trusting his judgment. Gerard sagged with visible relief at the news that the path would be easier. Only Thomas asked questions, wanting to know why they had not taken this route from the beginning, and Philip deflected with vague mentions of distance and terrain. The lower pass was indeed easier, the path wider and more clearly defined, winding through forests of pine and spruce rather than over bare rock. They made better time, and when they stopped for the night in a small valley with a clear stream and soft grass, the mood was noticeably lighter. People actually smiled as they set up camp, as Marcus told a joke that made Alina laugh, as Thomas demonstrated how much better his injured side was feeling. Philip found himself relaxing slightly, allowing himself to hope that perhaps they would make it after all, that perhaps this desperate flight would end in something other than tragedy. He was helping Alina set up her bedroll when Karga appeared at his elbow, her expression tense. "We are being watched," she said quietly. His hand went automatically to the knife at his belt. "How many?" "At least 3. In the trees to the north. They have been following us for the last hour. Soldiers." "No," she paused. "Orcs." Philip's blood ran cold. "Your clan?" "I believe so." "What do we do?" Karga looked at him, and he saw conflict warring in her eyes. "I will go speak with them. Try to negotiate safe passage. But you must stay here, must keep the others calm. If they see humans and orcs together peacefully, it may cause violence." "I'm not letting you go alone," Philip said immediately. "You cannot come with me. Your presence would make things worse." "Then we find another way. We run, we hide, There is no other way," Karga interrupted gently. "This is my people, my responsibility. Let me try to fix this." She walked away before he could argue further, disappearing into the trees with her hands raised and empty to show she meant no harm. Philip stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to follow her to make sure she was safe, but knowing she was right that his presence would only inflame the situation. Marcus approached, frowning. "Where is she going?" "To negotiate," Philip said tersely. "Negotiate with whom?" Before Philip could answer, figures emerged from the forest. 3 orcs, all male, all armed with spears and axes, all watching the human encampment with unconcealed hostility. Karga stood before them, speaking rapidly in the orcish language that Philip did not understand, her posture simultaneously deferential and defiant. "Gods above," Marcus breathed. "Are those—" "Stay calm," Philip ordered, his voice carrying enough authority that Marcus fell silent. "Nobody moves. Nobody reaches for weapons. We let Karga handle this." But even as he spoke, he could see the confrontation intensifying. The largest of the 3 orcs, a massive figure with ritual scars covering his arms and a necklace of what looked like teeth around his neck, was shouting now, pointing at Karga, and then at the humans. Karga shouted back, her hands gesturing emphatically, her whole body radiating frustration. Then the big orc's hand shot out, catching Karga by the throat and lifting her off her feet. Philip moved without thinking, sprinting across the clearing with his knife drawn. He heard Marcus yelling behind him, heard Alina's scream of alarm, but it all seemed distant compared to the roaring in his ears. The orc saw him coming and threw Karga aside like a rag doll, turning to meet Philip's charge with a grin that showed far too many teeth. The spear thrust came at Philip's chest, and he barely managed to twist aside, feeling the point score a line of fire across his ribs. He stumbled, tried to regain his footing, and the orc was on him, one massive hand closing around his wrist with crushing force. The knife fell from nerveless fingers, and Philip found himself lifted into the air, dangling helplessly as the orc drew back his other fist for a killing blow. "Torgan, stop!" Karga's voice cracked like a whip across the clearing. The orc Torgan paused, his fist still raised, and looked at her. She was on her feet now, blood trickling from a split lip, her eyes blazing with fury. She spoke rapidly in Orcish, her voice hard and commanding, and Philip felt the grip on his wrist loosen slightly. Torgan responded, his tone mocking, and Karga's expression went even harder. She said something else, something that made all 3 orcs stiffen, and pointed at Philip with one shaking hand. Torgan stared at her for a long moment, then at Philip, then back at Karga. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he lowered Philip to the ground and released him. Philip staggered, catching himself against a tree, his crushed wrist already swelling. Karga crossed to him immediately, her hands gentle as she examined his injury. "You foolish human," she muttered, but there was no real anger in her voice. "I told you to stay back." "He was choking you," Philip said through gritted teeth. "He was making a point. He would not have killed me." She glanced at Torgan, who was watching them with a calculating expression. though he might have killed you if I had not intervened." "What did you say to him?" Karga hesitated. "I claimed you as my mate under Orcish law. It is the only relationship that would give you protection in their eyes, the only reason they would have to let you live after you attacked one of them." Philip felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "Your mate," he repeated numbly. "It is not real," she said quickly, not meeting his eyes. "Just a lie to keep you alive. But you must act the part now, or they will know I deceived them and kill us both." Before Philip could respond, Torgen approached, the other two orcs flanking him. He said something in Orcish, his voice gruff and suspicious. Karga replied, then turned to Philip. "He wants to know if you truly wish to be bound to me. If you claim it is against your will, they will free you and kill me for dishonoring their laws." Philip looked at the three hostile orcs, at Karga standing before him with blood on her face and fear in her eyes despite her brave front, at the humans huddled together by the tents waiting to see if violence would erupt. He thought about the past weeks, about everything they had been through together, about falling asleep with her hand in his and waking up feeling more at peace than he had in years. "Tell him yes," Philip said clearly. "Tell him I claim you as my mate willingly and with full knowledge of what that means." Karga's eyes widened. "Philip, you do not have to tell him." She translated, her voice slightly unsteady, and Torgen grunted. He spoke again at length this time, and Karga listened with growing tension. When he finished, she turned to Philip with an expression that was equal parts relief and dread. "He says we may pass through their territory, but only because you are now under my protection as my mate. He says he will be watching, and if he learns I have lied about this bond, he will hunt us both down and kill us slowly." She swallowed hard. "He also says we must present ourselves before the clan elders tomorrow to have the union formally recognized. It is their law." "Then we'll do it," Philip said, with more confidence than he felt. Torgen and the other orcs withdrew into the forest, though Philip had the distinct sense they were not going far. The humans clustered around him immediately, everyone talking at once, demanding explanations. Philip raised his hands for silence, wincing as the movement jarred his injured wrist. "Karga has negotiated safe passage through this territory," he said carefully. "But there are conditions. We have to present ourselves to the local clan tomorrow for formal approval. In the meantime, we camp here and try to rest." "What kind of conditions?" Marcus demanded. "What did she promise them?" "That is between Karga and me," Philip said firmly. "All you need to know is that we are safe for now." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but Alina put a hand on his arm and shook her head slightly. The group dispersed slowly, shooting curious glances at Philip and Karga, and eventually the camp settled into an uneasy quiet. Philip found Karga sitting by the stream, staring into the water with her arms wrapped around her knees. He lowered himself carefully beside her, favoring his injured wrist. "You should let me wrap that," she said without looking at him. "In a minute." He was quiet for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. "This mate thing, what does it actually mean? What have I agreed to?" "Among orcs, a mating bond is for life," Karga said quietly. "It means you are pledged to each other, that you share resources and responsibilities, that you defend each other above all others. It means your fates are joined." She finally looked at him, her expression guarded. "But it is not real. Once we cross the border, once we are safe, we can simply go our separate ways. Torgen and his clan will never know." "And what if I don't want to go our separate ways?" She went very still. "What?" Philip took a breath, committing fully to the words he was about to speak. "What if I meant it when I claimed you as my mate? What if I want this to be real? You do not know what you are saying. You are grateful because I helped you, confused because we have been through much together, but I'm in love with you," Philip interrupted, and saying it out loud felt like breaking through ice into clear water beneath. I have been for weeks, maybe longer. I just did not let myself see it because it seemed impossible, because you are orc and I am human and the world says it cannot work, but I do not care what the world says anymore. He reached out with his good hand, gently turning her face toward his. I love you, Karga. I want to be your mate, now and for the rest of my life if you will have me. Tears gathered in her amber eyes, spilling over to track down her green cheeks. I am orc, she whispered. I am everything your people fear and hate. If you bind yourself to me, you will never be able to return to human lands. You will be outcast forever. I was already outcast the moment I chose to protect you, Philip pointed out, and I would make that choice again 1,000 times. He wiped away her tears with his thumb, marveling at the softness of her skin. You are brave and loyal and fierce and kind. You are the first person in my life who made me want to be better than I am. So yes, I am sure, I want this. I want you. I love you too, Karga said, the words breaking from her like a confession. I have loved you since the moment you gave me food and asked nothing in return. I have loved you every day since, and I thought I would die with that love unspoken, because I never believed you could feel the same. Philip kissed her then, leaning forward to press his lips against hers in a kiss that was awkward and wonderful and tasted of salt from her tears. Her tusks pressed gently against his face, and he found he loved even that, loved every part of her that made her who she was. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and smiled. So we do this properly tomorrow, he asked. We go before your clan and make this real. We do this properly, she agreed. Though I should warn you, orcish mating ceremonies involve bloodletting and vows spoken in combat form, and several challenges you will have to pass. Challenges. Nothing too difficult. You just have to prove you are strong enough to be a worthy mate, brave enough to defend me, and skilled enough to provide for a family. Philip groaned. This is going to be a long day, isn't it? Karga laughed, the sound bright and genuine, and pulled him close. Yes, she admitted. But we will face it together. They sat by the stream until full dark, talking quietly about everything and nothing, making plans for a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. Eventually they returned to camp, and if the others noticed they were holding hands, no one commented. Philip spread his bedroll next to Karga's, and they lay down side by side, fingers intertwined, watching the stars wheel overhead through gaps in the trees. Philip, Karga said softly. Yes. Thank you for seeing me as a person, for choosing me over everything else, for loving me even when it was hard. He squeezed her hand. Thank you for the same. Sleep came easily that night, warm and dreamless, and when Philip woke with the dawn, it was to find Karga already up and preparing for the day ahead. She had changed into different clothes, leather trousers, and a tunic decorated with intricate beadwork that she told him was traditional orcish formal wear. She had unbraided her hair so it fell loose around her shoulders, had painted symbols on her cheeks in red ochre, had armed herself with a curved sword that looked well used and deadly. You look incredible, Philip said honestly. She smiled, nervous and pleased. You need to prepare as well. The ceremony begins at midday. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Karga taught him the basic phrases he would need to speak in Orcish, correcting his pronunciation with patient repetition. She explained the structure of the ceremony, the challenges he would face, the responses he would need to give. Marcus and the others watched with a mixture of confusion and concern, but Philip had no time to explain properly. All his focus had to be on learning what he needed to know to survive the next few hours. At noon, Torgan and a dozen other orcs appeared at the edge of the clearing. They were all in formal dress, armed and painted for ceremony, their faces grave. Torgin gestured for Philip and Karga to follow, and they fell into step behind the group as they wound deeper into the forest. They walked for perhaps an hour, climbing into the hills until they reached a natural amphitheater of stone. 50 or more orcs were gathered there, men, women, children, all watching with suspicious, hostile eyes as Philip and Karga entered the space. At the center of the amphitheater sat 3 elderly orcs on carved wooden seats. Their faces seamed with age and wisdom, their bearing radiating authority. These were the clan elders, Karga whispered, and it was to them that Philip would have to prove himself. The ceremony began with ritual greetings that Philip stumbled through phonetically, earning frowns from the assembled orcs. Then came the questions, fired at him in Orcish by the eldest of the 3 leaders, a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint. Karga translated, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "Why do you wish to join with an orc?" "Because I love her," Philip answered. "Because she is the best person I have ever known, and I want to spend my life proving myself worthy of her." "You are human. You are weak and soft, and your people have brought nothing but suffering to ours. What makes you think you can provide for an orc mate?" "I do not claim to be strong in body," Philip said carefully, "but I am strong in will. I am loyal, I am brave when I need to be, and I will work every day of my life to give Karga the safety and happiness she deserves." The questions went on, each one harder than the last, each one designed to test his resolve and expose any weakness. Philip answered as best he could, drawing on everything Karga had taught him, speaking from the heart when his prepared words failed. The assembled orcs muttered among themselves, some nodding thoughtfully, others shaking their heads in clear disapproval. Finally, the elder woman raised a hand for silence. "You speak well," she acknowledged, "but words are easy. Now you must prove yourself through the 3 challenges." The first challenge was combat. Torgin stepped forward, armed with a wooden practice sword, and gestured for Philip to take up a similar weapon from a rack at the edge of the amphitheater. Philip's stomach sank. He was a farmer, not a warrior, and Torgin was a trained fighter who outweighed him by at least 80 pounds. But there was no refusing, so he took up the sword and moved to face his opponent. The fight was brutal and brief. Torgin came at him like a thunderstorm, all power and fury, and it took everything Philip had just to avoid being knocked unconscious in the first exchange. He blocked desperately, gave ground, tried to find some opening in the relentless assault. His injured wrist screamed protest with every parry, his breath came in ragged gasps, and he knew he was going to lose. Then he heard Karga's voice from the sidelines, shouting encouragement in Orcish, and something steadied inside him. He stopped trying to match Torgin's strength and started using his speed instead, dancing aside from heavy blows rather than blocking them, looking for the small openings that appeared when Torgin overcommitted to an attack. He got in one good strike, catching Torgin across the ribs hard enough to make the big orc grunt, and the assembled crowd made a sound that might have been approval. Torgin responded with a spinning strike that Philip almost avoided, but not quite. The wooden blade caught him across the shoulder and sent him sprawling into the dirt, pain exploding through his upper body. He lay there for a moment, dazed, tasting blood, and heard the murmuring of the crowd. He had lost, failed the first challenge. It was over. But then hands were helping him up Torgin's hands, surprisingly gentle. The big orc said something in Orcish and nodded respectfully. Karga was suddenly there, translating, her face alight with pride. "He says you fought with honor and courage. He says you may not have won, but you proved you are brave enough to defend your mate. The first challenge is passed." Philip could barely process the words through the ringing in his ears, but he nodded and let Karga lead him to the side of the arena, where she pressed a waterskin into his hands and fussed over his injuries. The elders conferred briefly, then announced the second challenge. This one involved skill specifically, the ability to hunt and provide. Philip was given a bow and 3 arrows, and a target was set up at the far end of the amphitheater. A small clay disc hung from a wooden frame. He had to hit it 3 times, the elder explained, or fail the challenge. Philip had grown up hunting, had provided most of the meat for his family's table from the time he was old enough to draw a bow. But his shoulder was throbbing from Torgen's blow, his wrist was swollen and painful, and the target looked very small and very far away. He knocked the first arrow, drew carefully, and released. The arrow flew true, striking the edge of the disc with a sharp crack. The crowd murmured. Not a perfect hit, but good enough. The second arrow was harder. Philip's arms were shaking with fatigue and pain, and he had to wait for a gust of wind to pass before he could shoot. This arrow struck closer to the center, and he heard someone in the crowd call out what might have been approval. The third arrow was the hardest of all. Philip could barely hold the bow steady, could barely focus through the pain radiating from his shoulder. He drew, aimed, held his breath, and released. The arrow struck dead center, shattering the clay disc completely. The crowd erupted in a roar of approval that shocked Philip so much he nearly dropped the bow. The elders were nodding, speaking among themselves with what looked like satisfaction. Torgen was grinning and thumping his chest in what seemed to be a gesture of respect. And Karga was looking at Philip with such fierce pride and love that his heart felt too large for his chest. 2 challenges passed, the eldest elder announced. Now comes the third and final test, the test of the heart. This challenge was different. Philip was led to stand before the 3 elders, with Karga at his side. The eldest elder produced a ceremonial knife, its blade decorated with intricate carvings, and spoke in formal Orcish. Karga translated quietly. In Orcish tradition, mates must prove their bond is true by offering blood freely given. Each of you will cut your palm and then clasp hands, mingling your blood as you speak the words of binding. If either of you hesitates, if either shows fear or doubt, the union will be rejected. The elder woman looked directly at Philip. Human, do you understand what you do here? If you speak these vows, you are orc in the eyes of our people. You will never be human again. Your children will be orc. Your life will be lived by orc law and custom. There is no going back. Do you accept this? Philip met Karga's eyes, seeing his own uncertainty reflected there, but also hope and love and trust. He thought about his old life, the farm he would never see again, the human community that had already rejected him for helping her. Then he thought about the past weeks, about every moment they had shared, about the future they could build together. "I accept," he said clearly. The elder handed him the knife. Philip took it, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like a cloak. He pressed the blade to his palm and drew it across, feeling the sharp bite of pain and the warm rush of blood. Then he handed the knife to Karga, who performed the same ritual without flinching. They clasped hands, palm to palm, blood mingling in the space between them. The elder began to chant in Orcish, a rhythmic incantation that seemed to resonate in Philip's bones. Karga spoke the next words, her voice strong and clear, and Philip repeated them phonetically, trusting her to guide him through. The words were about loyalty and strength, about shared burdens and shared joys, about promising to stand together against whatever might come. With each phrase, Philip felt something shifting inside him, some fundamental change taking place that he did not fully understand but welcomed nonetheless. This was no simple marriage ceremony. This was deeper, older, binding in ways that went beyond legal or social contract. When the last words were spoken, the elder woman stood and raised her hands. The challenges are past. The vows are spoken. The blood is mingled. I declare before this clan that Karga and Philip are mated, bound by law and custom, recognized as one union. She fixed Philip with a stern look. You are orc now, human who was. Welcome to Clan Stormbreak. The amphitheater erupted in cheers and shouts, orcs surging forward to congratulate them with back-slapping enthusiasm that nearly knocked Philip off his feet. Torgon embraced Karga like a brother, said something that made her laugh, then turned to Philip and offered his hand. Philip took it, and the big orc pulled him into a crushing hug that made his ribs creak. You are brave for a human, Torgon said in heavily accented common. I like you. You take care of Karga or I kill you. That seems fair, Philip managed, and Torgon roared with laughter. The celebration lasted well into the evening. Food appeared from somewhere, roasted meat and flatbread, and something fermented that the orcs drank with obvious enjoyment, and that made Philip's eyes water when he tried it. Music started, drums and pipes playing rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Orcs danced, told stories, sang songs in their own language that Philip could not understand but found beautiful nonetheless. Through it all, Karga stayed close to his side, translating when needed, introducing him to clan members, laughing with genuine joy for the first time since he had known her. She was home, Philip realized. This was where she belonged among her people, and she had been in exile because of him. But now, miraculously, she was welcomed back, and he was welcomed with her. As the moon rose, an elderly orc woman approached them. She had kind eyes and hands gnarled with age, and she spoke to Karga in gentle tones before turning to Philip. I am Grandmother Mara, she said in careful common. I speak for the clan mothers. We have prepared dwelling for you and your mate. You will stay with us now, make home here. We will teach you our ways. Philip glanced at Karga, uncertain. But we were going to cross the border, he said. The humans I am traveling with, your friends may go where they wish, Grandmother Mara said. We will guide them safely to border, but you are clan now. Your place is here. Philip felt torn. He had responsibilities to Marcus and Alina and the others, people who had trusted him to lead them to safety. But he also had responsibilities to Karga now, to the vows he had just spoken, to the life they were beginning. He looked at her helplessly, unsure what to choose. We will speak with them, Karga said. Explain the situation. They will understand. They returned to the temporary camp where the human refugees waited, and Philip explained everything that had happened, the ceremony, the vows, the offer from the clan. Marcus listened with a deepening frown, but Alina smiled and took Philip's hand. We always knew you might not come with us all the way, she said gently. You have given us so much already: safety, hope, guidance. Now it is time for you to think of yourself and your future. The border is only 2 days from here, Marcus added gruffly. We can make it on our own now that we are through the worst terrain. You have earned the right to be happy, Philip. Gerard nodded agreement, and even young Thomas, who had been quiet throughout, stepped forward to clasp Philip's shoulder. Thank you for everything, he said simply. I hope you find joy with your mate. The next morning, with the help of several orc scouts, the refugees broke camp and continued toward the border. Philip watched them go with mixed emotions: relief that they would be safe, sadness at the parting, hope for their futures and his own. Karga stood beside him, her hand warm in his, and when the last figure disappeared among the trees, she turned to him with a smile. Come, she said. Let me show you your new home. The dwelling Grandmother Mara had mentioned turned out to be a small but solid cabin on the outskirts of the main settlement. built from stone and timber in the Orcish style with a steep roof to shed snow and wide windows that let in the mountain light. Inside it was simple but comfortable, a large main room with a hearth, a sleeping alcove with furs piled on a wooden platform, storage spaces built into the walls, everything clean and ready for them. The clan built this for newly mated pairs, Karga explained. It is yours now, ours. Philip walked slowly through the space, running his hands over the smooth wood, feeling the warmth of the banked fire in the hearth. It was strange to think of this as home after a lifetime in the lowlands, strange to imagine building a life here among people who had been strangers just days before. But it also felt right in a way he could not quite articulate, as if some part of him had been waiting for this without knowing it. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we live," Karga said simply. "We make this place ours. We learn to be together properly, not just running and fighting but building something that lasts." She smiled. "And eventually, when you are ready, I will teach you how to be properly orc." "That sounds like a lot of work," Philip observed. "It will be," she agreed. "But you are strong enough for it. You proved that yesterday." They spent the rest of the day settling in, unpacking their meager belongings, accepting gifts of food and supplies from various clan members who stopped by to offer welcome. By evening Philip was exhausted but content, sitting by the hearth while Karga prepared a meal from the provisions they had been given. The domesticity of it was startling. Just weeks ago they had been fleeing for their lives, and now here they were, cooking dinner together like any normal couple. "Are you happy?" Karga asked suddenly, looking up from the pot she was stirring. "Yes," Philip said, and realized it was completely true. "Are you?" "More than I thought possible," she admitted. "When I escaped from those cages, all I wanted was to be free to survive. I never imagined I might find love or home or any of this. We are both lucky then. Very lucky." They ate together as the sun set, watching the light fade from gold to orange to deep purple through the western window. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleaned, they sat by the fire and simply talked, sharing stories from their lives before they met, learning the thousand small details that made each other who they were. Philip told her about growing up on the farm, about his parents who had died when he was 16, about the quiet loneliness of working the land alone year after year. Karga told him about her childhood in the clan, about learning to hunt and fight, about the sister she had lost in the raid and the friends who had been taken prisoner with her. "You think they are still alive?" Philip asked gently. "The others who were captured with you?" "I do not know," Karga said. "I hope so. But even if they survived, they may not wish to return here. The clan has strict laws about those who allow themselves to be captured by enemies. That seems unfair." "Many things about clan law are harsh by human standards," she acknowledged. "But they exist to keep us strong, to ensure we survive in a world that often wants us dead. You will learn this as you live here." "Will they accept me?" Philip asked. "Truly, I mean, not just because of the ceremony, but as one of them." "That depends on you," Karga said honestly. "If you work hard, learn our ways, contribute to the clan, then yes, in time they will accept you fully. But it will not be easy. Some will always see you as human first, orc second. You must prove yourself again and again." "I can do that," Philip said with more confidence than he felt. "I know you can," Karga said, and kissed him gently. That night they lay together in the sleeping alcove, wrapped in furs against the mountain cold, and for the first time truly began their life as mates. There was awkwardness and nervousness and moments of laughter that broke the tension, but beneath it all was the deep current of love and trust they had built over weeks of shared hardship. When they finally fell asleep, tangled together under the furs, Philip felt more at peace than he had since childhood. The weeks that followed were filled with learning and adjustment. Philip worked alongside clan members, helping with the harvest of mountain herbs and roots, learning to identify edible plants and useful materials. He practiced fighting techniques with Torgon and the other warriors, absorbing lessons in orcish combat style that emphasized power and leverage over speed and finesse. He studied the orcish language with patient teachers who corrected his pronunciation and laughed at his mistakes without malice. It was hard work, physically and mentally exhausting, and there were days when he wondered if he would ever truly belong. But Karga was always there, encouraging him when he struggled, celebrating his successes, reminding him why he had chosen this path. And slowly, gradually, he began to feel the clan accepting him not as a curiosity or an outsider who had been tolerated, but as a genuine member of the community. The turning point came during the first snowfall, about 2 months after the mating ceremony. A young orc child, a girl perhaps 6 years old, got separated from a hunting party and was lost in the forest as a blizzard rolled in. The clan organized search parties, but the conditions were brutal, and hope was fading as the hours passed. Philip had an idea. Growing up in the lowlands, he had spent countless winter days tracking deer through snow, and he knew techniques for reading tracks and anticipating an animal's movement that the mountain orcs did not use. He explained his thoughts to Karga, who translated for Torgon, who grudgingly agreed to let Philip try. Philip led a small group into the storm, following signs that others had missed: a broken branch here, a disturbed patch of snow there. He thought like a frightened child rather than an experienced hunter, looking for places of shelter, for paths of least resistance. After 3 hours of searching in near whiteout conditions, they found her huddled in a hollow tree, half frozen but alive. When they returned to the settlement with the child safe, her parents wept with gratitude, and the clan elders formally thanked Philip before the entire community. From that day forward, the last vestiges of suspicion melted away. He was no longer the human who had married into the clan. He was simply Philip, one of them, valued and respected. Winter passed into spring and spring into summer. Philip and Karga built a life together that was rich in small moments and quiet joys. They expanded the cabin, adding a workshop where Philip could practice the woodworking skills he taught himself from clan craftsmen. They planted a garden, mixing orcish mountain vegetables with lowland crops that Philip remembered from his farm. They hosted dinners for friends, took long walks through the forest, made love under the stars on warm summer nights, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk about children. "The clan mothers say we are ready," Karga said one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "They say we have proven we can build a stable home, that we are good examples for the young ones." "What do you say?" Philip asked. "I say I want to have a family with you," Karga answered. "Want to raise children who know they are loved, who grow up understanding that orc and human can live together in peace. Want to give them the life I dreamed of when I was in those cages, thinking I would die alone." "Then let's do it," Philip said, pulling her close. "Let's have the family we both want." 8 months later, on a clear winter morning with fresh snow sparkling on the ground, Karga gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, both healthy and strong, with their mother's green skin and their father's eyes. The clan celebrated for 3 days, and Philip stood before the elders with his children in his arms and felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. They named the boy Tomer, after Karga's father who had died in the raid. They named the girl Elena, after the human woman who had shown Philip kindness during their flight to the border. The children were perfect, miraculous, and as Philip watched Karga nurse them, he felt tears streaming down his face. "Why do you cry?" she asked gently. "Because I am so happy," Philip managed. Because all of this our home, our children, our clan is more than I ever dared to hope for. Because that night I could not sleep and sat by the fire, and you murmured my name from across the room, and everything changed." Karga smiled, her eyes bright with tears of her own. "I remember that night," she said. "I was so afraid to speak, so certain you would reject me, but I could not help myself. I needed you to know you were not alone." "I have not been alone since," Philip said, "and I never will be again." The years rolled on, bringing new challenges and new joys. Tamer and Alina grew into bright, curious children who moved easily between Orcish and human ways, learning both languages, comfortable in both cultures. Philip became one of the clan's primary hunters, his skills refined through years of practice. His knowledge of lowland game invaluable when trading parties made the long journey to the border regions. Karga took a position as a teacher, instructing young orcs in history and tradition, ensuring the next generation understood both their own heritage and the wider world they lived in. There were hard times, too. A particularly brutal winter when food ran short, and they had to strictly ration supplies. A border skirmish with human soldiers that left 3 clan members dead and others wounded. Moments when the old prejudices flared up, and Philip faced hostility from orcs who still saw him as an outsider, or when they traveled to human lands, and Karga endured hateful stares and whispered slurs. But they faced everything together, as they had promised in their vows. When Philip struggled, Karga was his strength. When Karga faltered, Philip was her anchor. They were partners in the truest sense, building a life that honored both their backgrounds while creating something entirely new. On their 10th anniversary as mates, the clan held a celebration in their honor. It was rare for mixed unions to succeed, rarer still for them to thrive as Philip and Karga's had. The elders spoke of them as an example, as proof that the old enmities between orc and human need not define the future. Young orcs and the handful of other humans who had joined the clan looked to them as role models, as evidence that love could cross even the deepest divides. That night, after the feasting and music had ended, Philip and Karga walked up to a high ridge overlooking the settlement. They stood together in the moonlight, their children asleep at home under the watchful eyes of grandmother Mara, and looked out at the world they had built. "Do you ever regret it?" Karga asked. "Giving up your human life for this?" "Never," Philip said without hesitation. "That life was lonely and small. This life is full of love and meaning. I would make the same choice every time, even knowing all the hardship that came with it, especially knowing that," Philip said. "The hardship made us stronger, made us who we are." Karga leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. In the distance, a wolf howled, and from the settlement below came the sound of laughter and music continuing into the night. This was home, Philip thought. This strange, beautiful, impossible life they had created together was home, and he would defend it with everything he had for as long as he lived. "I love you," Karga said softly. "I love you too," Philip replied, "now and always." They walked back down the ridge together, hand in hand, returning to the cabin where their children slept and their life waited. And if sometimes Philip thought back to that night so many years ago when he could not sleep and sat by the fire, when Karga murmured his name from across the room and changed his entire world, he did so with nothing but gratitude for the courage she had shown and the path they had chosen together. Their story was not the one either of them had expected. It was better. In the years that followed, Philip and Karga watched their children grow into strong, capable adults who embodied the best of both cultures. Tamer became a skilled negotiator, traveling between orc clans and human settlements to forge new alliances and trade agreements. using his unique heritage to bridge gaps that had existed for generations. Elena became a healer, combining Orcish herbal knowledge with human medical techniques. She learned from traveling doctors, saving countless lives from both peoples. The clan continued to thrive, growing slowly as other mixed families joined them, as orcs and humans who had been rejected by their own communities found acceptance in the mountains. Philip helped establish a council that gave representation to both species, creating governance structures that honored Orcish tradition while incorporating concepts of fairness and justice that resonated with his human background. When Grandmother Mara finally passed peacefully in her sleep at the remarkable age of 97, it was Philip who was asked to speak at her funeral, standing before the entire clan to honor the woman who had welcomed him when he was nothing but a frightened human who had made promises he barely understood. The elders noted that his Orcish was flawless now, that his understanding of their ways was complete, that he had become one of the most respected members of the community. But none of that mattered as much as the life he shared with Karga. Through everything, the triumphs and setbacks, the joy and sorrow, the mundane dailiness and the extraordinary moments, they remained partners, lovers, best friends. They grew old together gracefully, their hair going gray, their bodies accumulating the scars and aches of a life fully lived. On the night of their 40th anniversary as mates, they sat together by the fire in their cabin, the same cabin they had moved into as terrified newlyweds, now expanded and modified and filled with 40 years of memories. Their grandchildren played outside, the sounds of laughter drifting through the windows. Philip looked at Karga, really looked at her, seeing the woman who had risked everything for him, who had given him a family and a purpose and a home. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Karga asked, though her smile suggested she knew. "For murmuring my name that night," Philip said. "For being brave enough to reach out when I was lost. For loving me even when it made no sense. For building this life with me." Karga took his hand, her grip still strong despite the arthritis that was beginning to stiffen her fingers. "I would do it all again," she said. "Every moment, every choice, every hardship, because it led to this, to us, to everything we have become." They sat together in the firelight, comfortable in the silence that comes from decades of understanding, and Philip felt the same peace he had felt that first night when he had finally been able to sleep with Karga beside him. The world outside was still complicated, still full of prejudice and pain and people who could not or would not see past their differences. But here, in this cabin, in this clan, in the family they had built together, there was love and acceptance and hope. And that, Philip thought as Karga leaned her head against his shoulder, was more than enough. That was everything. Years later, when Philip's time finally came peacefully, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, with Karga holding his hand just as she had held it on their first night together, his last thought was not of regret or fear, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the woman who had murmured his name across a dark room and changed his life forever. Gratitude for every day they had shared, every challenge they had overcome, every moment of joy and sorrow and simple contentment. Karga lived another 5 years after Philip's passing, spending her time teaching the young ones and tending her garden and telling stories about the human who had loved an orc when the world said it was impossible. When her time came, she went peacefully as well, and the clan laid her to rest beside Philip in the high meadow where they had often walked together, where the wind sang through the grasses and the mountains stood eternal against the sky. Their children erected a simple stone marker that bore both their names and a single line in both Orcish and Common. They chose love over fear and changed the world. And in the generations that followed, when young orcs and humans who struggled with their own place in the world came to the settlement seeking guidance. They were brought to that meadow and told the story of Philip and Karga. Told how a human man who could not sleep sat by a fire one night, and an orc woman found the courage to murmur his name across a dark room, and how that simple moment of connection had blossomed into a love that transformed not just their lives, but the lives of everyone around them. The story became legend, then myth, a tale told around fires to inspire hope and courage in those who needed it most. But for those who had known them, who had watched them build their life together day by day, year by year, it was simply the truth. Love was possible, even across the deepest divides. Home could be found in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, when you could not sleep and sat by the fire in the darkness, someone might murmur your name and offer you the possibility of everything you had ever wanted but never dared to dream of. That was the legacy Philip and Karga left behind. Not grand monuments or sweeping political change, but the simple, powerful truth that connection and compassion and love could overcome even the most entrenched hatred and fear. Their story proved that different peoples could not just coexist, but thrive together, creating something richer and more beautiful than either could achieve alone. And on quiet nights in the settlement that grew from the small clan they had joined so many years before, when the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, sometimes the wind through the mountains sounded almost like a voice murmuring names into the darkness, calling to the lost, the lonely, the frightened, promising them that they too could find love and home and acceptance if they were brave enough to answer. The story of Philip and Karga lived on, a beacon of hope in a complicated world, a reminder that the most impossible love stories sometimes turned out to be the most true. And every couple who chose each other across divides of culture or species or background, every person who reached out to someone different from themselves with compassion instead of fear, carried forward the legacy they had begun that night, when an orc woman murmured a human man's name across a dark room and changed both their lives forever.